committee will come to order. Today's hearing will examine ongoing and rising shortages of medications, which range from drugs used in hospitals to provide critical care and treat serious diseases like cancers, to prescription medications and even common over-the-counter remedies to treat cold and flu symptoms. After a winter with high cold, flu, and RSV cases, many of us have gone to the store and have seen bare shelves due to shortages of children's Tylenol and Motrin. Others have faced shortages of key prescription medications, including antibiotics. Throughout the country, hospitals regularly experience shortages of a range of drugs needed for emergency care, for surgeries, and for other procedures. These often include sterile injectable drugs like IV saline solution and sodium bicarbonate needed to provide critical care, dialysis, and other life-saving treatments. Some of these products have been in shortage for over a decade. For example, lidocaine, used to manage pain, has remained in shortage since 2011. Vancomycin, used to treat bacterial infections, has been in shortage since 2009. Even drugs needed to treat childhood and adult cancers, including some that have simply no alternative treatment, are regularly in shortage. And while some shortages may only be an inconvenience, others have had devastating impacts on patient care. These shortages, which reached a peak of 295 individual drugs in shortage at the end of 2022, have left healthcare professionals grappling with limited resources to treat patients in need. Drug shortages are certainly not new. There are a number of factors that contribute to drug shortages, including economic drivers that lead to a lack of manufacturers willing to enter or to remain in the market or invest in quality manufacturing systems, insufficient visibility into the entire supply chain for critical medications, and an over-reliance on foreign and geographically concentrated sources for the materials needed to make these drugs. Taken together, these underlying causes not only present serious concerns about providing adequate care to patients, they also represent serious national security threats. In 2019, I released a report identifying many of these national security risks and how they contributed to drug shortages and, in some cases, price hikes. My report found that nearly 80% of the manufacturing facilities that produce active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, the key ingredients that give the drug its intended effect, are located outside of the United States, and many of our APIs are sourced from either China or India. Last month, after I released that report, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread, or I should say just months after I released that report, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread around the globe, we saw firsthand how our over-reliance on foreign producers for medical products, along with failures to adequately prepare for a pandemic, quickly led to widespread shortages of desperately needed medications and medical supplies like personal protective equipment. Today, I'm releasing a new report that I'm holding up here that builds on those previous findings and identifies additional recommendations to strengthen domestic manufacturing of critical drugs and limit the disruptions caused by shortages and supply chain issues. I now move to introduce this report into the record, and without objection, the report will be included in the hearing record. My report finds that between 2021 and 2022, new drug shortages increased by nearly 30%. And that both the pharmaceutical industry and the federal government, including the Food and Drug Administration, lack the information needed to effectively detect and to prevent shortages. Most significantly, this updated report found that our continued over-reliance on foreign suppliers for the key materials needed to make critical drugs, primarily those in China, remain an unacceptable national security risk. For example, over 90% of generic injectable drugs used to treat serious injuries or illnesses in the U.S. rely on key materials from China and India. And nearly 90% of generic API manufacturing sites are located overseas. My report makes several recommendations to help protect our health and our national security, including to invest in advanced manufacturing capabilities to produce critical drugs here in the United States, and require that the FDA and its interagency partners get the information needed to better monitor supply chain vulnerabilities and to anticipate possible shortages. I'm encouraged by recent legislative and executive actions to bolster our medical supply chain resiliency. Last Congress, I helped author a bipartisan provision to increase visibility into where critical medical supplies and drugs are produced. And this Congress, I'm working on legislation that builds on many of the report recommendations to protect our health and national security. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to advance these important measures. Today's discussion with our panel of expert witnesses will provide even more detail about what Congress and our federal agencies should do to address both drug shortages and national security risk that they present, and I look forward to the conversation. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Paul for his opening statement.
Ever wonder why we never have shortages of iPhones or computers? What separates the drug industry from the computer or smartphone industries? Computers and smartphones, like drugs, are highly technical and globalized industries, yet there are seldom shortages in any of these industries. However, unlike the computer, automobile, or smartphone industry, the needs addressed by the drug manufacturing industry are often a matter of life and death. This is why the decisions and policymakers and regulators are of utmost importance. Rules and regulations that inhibit the production of drugs will create pain for hospitals and patients. The Food and Drug Administration recently identified a shortage of 120 different drugs. Some of these drugs, such as saline, are necessary for the most basic treatments. These shortages are not a new phenomenon. This has been going on for quite some time. Since 2007, the FDA identified an average of over 100 separate drug shortages per year. In 2011, the FDA identified a whopping 267 drugs in short supply. Despite possessing the most innovative medical industry in the world, the U.S. is unable to maintain a consistent supply of the most crucial medicines. We have to understand why. We understand there's a problem, but we got to understand why this is happening. While many blame these shortages on foreign producers, so-called greedy pharmaceutical companies, and even hospitals, it's no coincidence that the rise in drug shortages correlates with the expanded regulatory reach of the FDA. Drug shortages force doctors to consider rationing medicines and postponing essential procedures and force patients to needlessly suffer. While our nation's hospitals have trouble purchasing the necessary amounts of drugs for cancer patients, heart attack victims, and those in chronic pain, these same hospitals find no such shortages when purchasing computers. Doctors and nurses do not have to cope with a smartphone shortage. There has to be an explanation here. The key difference between these industries and the drug manufacturing industry is obvious. The companies producing computers and smartphones are, by comparison, left to compete with one another with little manipulation from the government, while the FDA places the heavy yoke of regulation on drug manufacturers. This is the key difference. It's the heavy hand of government. Over 40 years ago, Milton Friedman remarked, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. While Friedman was discussing price controls and output restrictions on oil and gas production in Dubai, the same wisdom still holds for drug pricing in our country. The drug industry is one of the most regulated markets in the economy. Output controls, such as FDA's approval procedure for nearly every step of the manufacturing process, increases the cost of production and restrains the adaptability of manufacturers to meet shifting demands. When one company goes out of business, another one can't ramp up without asking permission to make more of a drug. If a drug manufacturer closes, the remaining manufacturers, which must react to increased demand, are forced to seek FDA approval to produce more than the originally approved amount or to produce quicker than the originally approved timeline. This is crazy, and we should stop it. Why does the United States embrace central planning in healthcare? Central planning produced shortages of even the most basic consumer goods in communist countries during the Cold War. There's a famous Soviet quip about a man entering a shop and asking the clerk, "You don't have any meat?" And the clerk says, "No, we're the store that doesn't have any fish." They were used to shortages. It was a common thing. It was a common enough that people joked about not being able to get enough of basic items. We should not tolerate central planning in a capitalist country for the most essential products on the market, further abandoning the principles of basic economics. Medicare price controls, such as requiring drug companies to pay rebates to Medicare if they raise their prices too quickly, create even more barriers to entry, which prevent competitors from arising in the market. Limiting the amount of drug production and producers results in artificially high prices and drug shortages. Americans will be healthier and live longer if their government allows innovators to provide drugs at affordable prices and produce a strong supply. I hope this hearing will identify the regulations that impede the ability of markets to do what they do best, provide for the consumer. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' testimony.
Thank you, Senator Paul. The practice of this committee is to swear in our witnesses. So if each of our witnesses would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Dr. Andrew Shuman, Associate Professor of Otolaryngology. I hope that's correct. That's quite a mouthful. He's also a head and neck surgery at the University of Michigan Medical School and Chief of Clinical Ethics Service at the Center for Bioethics and Social Science in Medicine. Dr. Shuman is an internationally recognized leader on ethical issues within his specialty and has authored numerous publications in several leading journals in the field, including the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Shuman, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and the committee for the privilege of speaking with you today. I'm a cancer surgeon and a medical ethicist, and I have a surgical practice and leadership roles at both the University of Michigan and the VA. I'm not speaking on behalf of either institution today. My personal experience with drug shortages began 15 years ago. At the time, there was a national shortage of propofol, an anesthetic we used to perform surgery that required anesthesiologists to improvise how to keep patients comfortable. You don't need to go to medical school to realize that patients need to stay asleep during their operation. Since that first experience, colleagues in other hospitals have asked me to help them respond to the never-ending game of drug shortage whack-a-mole. My goal for the next few minutes is to share some examples from my experience trying to protect patients from the serious medical consequences of not having access to the drugs they need. We are lucky enough to live in a country where cutting-edge research has massively reduced cancer-related deaths. But cancer drug shortages represent a tragedy that's happening in slow motion. For example, etoposide is a cancer drug that's been on the market for over 40 years and typically costs less than $50 a vial. It is given to patients for nearly a dozen different kinds of cancer. But in 2018, due to a manufacturing delay, this drug was on shortage across the country. Which of our patients with cancer should get it? How can we prioritize between American lives? Should our limited vials go to an older woman who is just diagnosed with lung cancer, a young man who has already been successfully taking it for testicular cancer, or a baby with neuroblastoma, an aggressive cancer for which this drug is recommended, but others might substitute? Our hospital, like others across the country, struggled to make decisions based on projected availability, which patients were already under our care, and our best guess at how many new patients would be diagnosed in the coming weeks. As a doctor who's devoted my life to fighting cancer, it's hard to express how horrible that is. In this particular case, we had enough drug for our lung and testicular cancer patients, and our heroic pharmacist was able to scrape together enough etoposide from the bottom of the leftover vials to also treat the infant patient. But our pharmacist should not be desperately trying to squeeze out a few last drops when a life may be on the line. While my focus is on oncology, drug shortages impact every field of medicine. For example, Senator Paul has dedicated his professional career to preserving and restoring his patients' vision. There are eye drops that literally keep people from going blind that cost a few dollars, but these are sometimes unavailable. All patients affected by drug shortages deserve better. And I would be remiss not to point out how the COVID pandemic has exacerbated drug shortages. My colleagues across the country have worked tirelessly over the past 3 years to take care of patients with COVID. We have learned quite a bit about how to conserve and ration healthcare resources and try to do so equitably to ensure that diverse patient communities have access to the best care possible. But all hospitals do not have access to the same resources. Michigan Medicine has multiple pharmacists whose full-time job is mitigating drug shortages, but not every hospital has that resource. Patients should not have better access to scarce drugs based on the hospital they go to. This is why I and my team have studied how institutions across regions can better communicate about ongoing shortages. One key role for lawmakers is to improve drug shortage monitoring and information sharing nationwide. Information sharing is a critical component of healthcare emergency preparedness. We often think of important resources in terms of staff, space, and stuff. For example, in April 2020, we desperately tried to make sure we had enough ventilators. This is the onset of the COVID pandemic. But a ventilator is just an expensive box if we do not have enough respiratory therapists to operate it. At Michigan Medicine, we had to train our medical students to help use the ventilators when we ran out of respiratory therapists. And even if we have enough ventilators and personnel, we still need enough hospital beds, which remain in short supply even today. Finally, the patient on that ventilator needs the proper medications to keep them sedated and comfortable. Ironically, the same medication, propofol, we ran out of in the operating room. We need to diversify where our medical supplies come from, including increasing production on American soil. Companies need to disclose the reasons they cannot meet demand. Otherwise, we will not know where to focus resources. In addition, drug pricing structures are not always reflective of their value to patients. We should incentivize companies to make high-quality, critical need drugs like the ones that I have mentioned, even if they have been less profitable historically. We can all agree that sick Americans deserve access to life-saving medications. Telling someone with cancer that they cannot receive a drug that was developed during the Johnson administration and costs less than my Uber ride from the airport is simply not acceptable. I thank the committee for highlighting this critical issue and finding creative legislative solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Shuman. Our next witness is Ms. Vimala Raghavendran, who is the Vice President of Informatics Product Development at U.S. Pharmacopoeia, or USP, an independent scientific nonprofit organization focused on building trust in the supply of safe, quality medicines. She led the development of USP's Medicine Supply Map, an information platform that identifies and forecasts risk in the generic drug supply chain to help predict potential shortages. Welcome, Ms. Raghavendran. You're welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and distinguished members of the committee for this opportunity to testify today. As you note, my name is Vimala Raghavendran, and I'm Vice President for Informatics Product Development at USP. I'm pleased to provide USP's perspective on the underlying causes of drug shortages and the reforms needed to improve the resiliency of our nation's medicine supply. USP is an independent scientific nonprofit organization founded in 1820 when 11 physicians took action to protect patients from poor quality medicines. Convening in the old Senate chamber, they published a national uniform set of guidelines for medicines called the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. A core pillar of USP's mission in the 200 or so years since then has been to help strengthen the pharmaceutical supply chain so that the medicines people rely on are available and meet quality standards. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938 created the requirement that medicines sold in the U.S. generally must adhere to USP standards. As a result, USP standards are used in the vast majority of FDA-registered facilities that make pharmaceutical finished doses and active ingredients. Drug shortages remain a persistent threat to both public health and national security. When there's a drug shortage, it means that a patient is not able to get a medicine they need to either protect their health or save their life. Recognizing the urgent need for more insight to guide solutions, USP invested in the development of a data intelligence platform, the Medicine Supply Map. As you note, Chairman Peters, our mission is to identify, characterize, and quantify supply chain risk so that stakeholders can anticipate and mitigate the impact of drug shortages. We quantified over 200 factors that contribute to drug shortages in order to build our models. Based on this work, USP has identified 4 types of risk that are correlated with drug shortages, many that you outlined in your opening statement. The first is geographic concentration. Our data shows that geographic concentration anywhere, including within the US, can result in drug shortages. The second factor is manufacturing complexity, which can take many forms. For example, the need to maintain sterility when making injectables, or the need for dedicated facilities to make certain types of antibiotics. The third factor is price. USP's analysis shows that lower-priced drugs have a higher likelihood of being in shortage. We see this particularly for older generics, like sterile injectables and antibiotics. Manufacturers only receive pennies per dose for some of these drugs. Fourth is quality. Drugs made at facilities that have a history of poor outcomes from FDA inspections are more likely to experience drug shortages, as are drugs with a history of recalls. Given these findings, USP makes the following recommendations to Congress. 1, establish an early warning system and research center of excellence that will help assess risks in the supply chain and predict drug shortages, giving stakeholders in the public and private sector enough notice to react. USP has started working on this, as have other organizations, but more work is needed. For example, policymakers are flying blind in our understanding of US reliance on other countries for critical ingredients used in the manufacture of medicines. 2, protect critical medicines with vulnerable supply chains by investing in solutions that incentivize new and efficient manufacturing technologies that have the potential to bring manufacturing back to the US. USP is working with FDA and other partners to facilitate the adoption of advanced manufacturing. Congress can help by making it easier for manufacturers by funding workforce development and the development of practices and methodologies that apply industry-wide. We thank Congress for the omnibus spending law passed in December 2022 that calls on HHS to establish centers of excellence that support advanced manufacturing. That was an important step. Finally, Congress should consider comprehensive solutions that extend beyond an exclusive focus on onshoring, given our finding that geographic diversity is important to a resilient medicine supply. Again, thank you to the committee for this opportunity for input. We welcome the prospect of serving as a resource to you as you seek solutions, and I look forward to answering any questions you have. Thank you.
Ms. Raghav and John, thank you so much for your comments today. Our next witness is Dr. Aaron Fox. Dr. Fox is the Associate Chief Pharmacy Officer of Shared Services and adjunct professor at the University of Utah College of Pharmacy. Dr. Fox's areas of expertise include drug shortages, medication use policy, drug information, evidence-based medicine, and drug cost. Dr. Fox, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and distinguished members of the committee for holding this hearing and for inviting me to participate. I'm the Associate Chief Pharmacy Officer for Shared Services at University of Utah Health, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the university today. I'm here to provide my perspective on drug shortages, highlight some of the problems shortages create, and offer 2 recommendations. My team and I at the University of Utah Drug Information Service have tracked national drug shortages since January 2001. We've received voluntary reports from healthcare providers who can't access important medicines for their patients. We confirm directly with manufacturers if there is or is not a shortage, and we post our findings to a public website that's hosted by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. Our goal in providing these data is to help clinicians mitigate the effects of drug shortages, providing estimated release dates, evidence-based safety and management suggestions. Currently, we're tracking 302 active drug shortages. Some patients have died due to drug shortages, most as a result of medication errors where substitute drugs were dosed incorrectly or emergency product was not available. Patients also suffer when alternative drugs have worse outcomes than the drug of choice, such as patients with sepsis who had a higher mortality rate during a shortage of norepinephrine. Shortages of chemotherapy have led to delayed treatments, delayed clinical trials for new therapies, reduced doses, and poor outcomes. In the background, pharmacists scramble. Most health systems have 1 or more full-time employees devoted exclusively to shortage management, directing medication switches, and spending time tracking down scarce products. Switching products is time-consuming and challenging in today's technologically advanced pharmacies. Switching just 2 drugs, for example, to be administered in syringes instead of saline bags did help us at our organization manage our saline shortage, but it also required us to review and manually change 700 patient treatment plans in a single day. The cause of a specific shortage is rarely publicly available. When we investigate shortages, we ask manufacturers for causes directly. We also use other available data, such as FDA inspection reports, but in most cases, we can't identify what triggered a specific shortage. Was it a quality problem, a demand increase, a prioritization issue to prioritize other products, problems accessing ingredients? Answers to these questions are important because they can give us clues about how long a shortage will last, and how long a shortage will last is something that companies often don't give us. Although we may not know what drives individual shortages, we now understand an important economic driver. There's no recognition for manufacturers that choose to invest in quality. FDA sees really clear quality differences between products and manufacturing sites, but this information is confidential and it's not available to the people making the purchases. Buyers can't easily see the reliability of manufacturing operations, so there's a race to the bottom for prices. The result of pressure from hospitals that are paid with capitated payments and group purchasing organizations that contract on behalf of hospitals. For a pharmacy buyer, the differentiating factor is price. I was part of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Consensus Committee on building resilience into the nation's medical product supply chains. Our committee provided a comprehensive set of recommendations, which I urge you to review. I have 2 recommendations that build on this report today. First, we need additional transparency to develop a rating system for pharmaceutical manufacturing reliability. FDA has been working to develop quality metrics ratings, but they don't intend to make the scores publicly available. A rating system could be used by health systems that are already paying more for shortages, with employees and time spent making drug switches. Hospitals would be wise to consider paying more for reliable supply agreements, particularly in the current setting of significant healthcare labor shortages. Payers and accreditation bodies can also incentivize hospitals to do the same to prevent poor patient outcomes. Second, if the federal government intends to use tax credits, loans, or subsidies to strengthen supply chains, FDA's current list of critical medications is not a good starting point. Understanding which products are most at risk would allow targeted, more effective actions to prevent or mitigate shortages with limited resources available. I'm concerned that without addressing the scope of the current FDA list and the scope of our analytical capabilities, the government may be overlooking some critical supply chains and their vulnerabilities and opportunities to strengthen supply chains. Thank you once again for holding this hearing, for the opportunity to share my perspective. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Our final witness is Dr. John Goodman. Dr. Goodman is president of the Goodman Institute for Public Policy Research. Dr. Goodman received his PhD in economics from Columbia University and has taught at Columbia University, Stanford University, Dartmouth University, Southern Methodist University, and the University of Dallas. Dr. Goodman regularly writes and speaks about health policy. Dr. Goodman, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator Peters, Senator Paul, and the rest of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. We have shortages, especially in the market for generic drugs, because number one, we have price controls in the Medicare Part B program. We have price controls in the 340B program. We have unproductive output regulations that Senator Paul so aptly described. And probably more important than those 3 things all combined is the fact that we have suppressed in this market normal market forces that eliminate shortages everywhere else in the economy. If the manufacturer of a generic drug finds a way to make that drug more reliable, more consistent, safer, even more efficacious, better at curing diseases, the manufacturer cannot communicate this information to the buyers of the drug. Therefore, he cannot profit by making these changes. What's happened in this market is the FDA imposes on the market a vision that all generics are the same. The only difference among them is price, and that's the only difference it allows to be communicated. So the principle here is that if you force buyers and sellers to compete on price and price alone, you're going to get a race to the bottom on every other feature of the product. And that's what's happening in this market. If I could compare it to another market, if there is a wine in surplus and the price goes down, Walmart buys it and stocks it. If there is a shortage of a wine, the price goes up. Walmart may not buy it at all. So in Dallas, Texas, when I go to Sam's Club, I know I'm going to pay the lowest price in all of Dallas, but they may not have the wine I want. If I go to a boutique wine shop, on the other hand, I may pay $1 or $2 more, but they will have the wine I want. What we're doing is we're forcing in the generic drug market the Walmart approach to every other product. Now, this report that you all are put out today, I think is, I got an advanced copy. I think it's really, really good on problems, better than I could have done in my testimony. It mentions a few things I've already mentioned. It says that in this market, people are competing on price alone, that there's a race to the bottom on every other feature of the product. It compares the market for brand drugs to the market for generics. All that is really good, but when we come to the solutions, there's one thing that is missing, and that is the observation that the reason why the generic market works the way it does is because we do not allow it to work in any other way. And let me just conclude by a reference to Senator Paul's reference to other markets, including the automobile market. You know, the battery in an electric car has parts that, in principle, come from 25 different countries. So we don't send inspectors off to those 25 countries to see what's happening elsewhere around the world. We look to Tesla. If the battery doesn't work, we blame Tesla and we don't buy the car. And that's the kind of model that we need to think about in reforming the market for generic drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. The Defense Logistics Agency basically buys its medication for the U.S. military from the same commercial market that gets its raw materials from foreign and geographically concentrated sources. Ms. Raghavendran, how at risk is the United States, for example, if another pandemic or a major earthquake or flood or other natural disaster hits where these drugs are sourced?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for that question, and also again for the opportunity to be here today. Our analysis suggests there is significant reliance on foreign sources when you look at finished dose forms and active pharmaceutical ingredients, and more for the latter than the former. There are some blind spots in this picture, though, which I will explain. When you examine facility and product registration counts, we see that the concentration is predominantly in India, lesser extent in Europe, and then followed by China. But what we have to keep in mind is that these are counts of facilities and product registrations. What it doesn't take into account is volume. So the volume could be concentrated in one facility among many, and we don't know that picture. Where we're flying completely blind is in our understanding of where the key raw chemicals that go into making the active ingredient come from. We have some anecdotal evidence, but we really have no systematic understanding.
Thank you. Dr. Fox, the Defense Department told my staff that with the exception of just 3 drugs, the DLA is not able to assess with certainty whether any of the other drugs it purchases rely solely on sources from either China or India. So given this blind spot, as was mentioned in the previous comments, what would happen to veterans, to military personnel, and to the U.S. healthcare system at large if these raw materials, including those sourced from China and India, simply became unavailable?
We would have significant shortages. And that's a little bit about what we have today, where our the DoD and our military are relying on the same commercial market as hospitals.
So the report that I released today and that Dr. Goodman referenced finds that our lack of supply chain visibility is basically a national security risk, and it persists at a time when active shortages that we are seeing today are actually on the rise. The COVID-19 pandemic only exacerbated this problem. So Dr. Fox, the FDA created the Essential Medicines List in 2020, but in your testimony you note that this list should not be the starting point for determining which drug supply chains are most vulnerable because I think, quote, it is not comprehensive for essential medical care, quoting your testimony today. Why is this so, and what should the federal government be doing differently?
Thank you for that question. You know, the government really needs to assess which products truly have a vulnerable supply chain. As my colleague mentioned, there may be very concentrated sources of key starting materials that it could look like we have a broad supply chain with maybe 5 to 6 manufacturers of something, but if each one of those companies is relying on a single key starting material that's only available in China or India, we simply don't know that. So we need to do more work to truly assess where the key vulnerabilities are. And FDA's essential medications list was not developed for that purpose. And in fact, it includes medications like filgrastim that have a very hardened manufacturing process where they could basically operate off the grid without any water, without any power, and they would still be producing filgrastim. And so we really need to target the true vulnerable products.
Dr. Shuman, we have data on drug shortages, but data on the impact of these shortages, especially on patient care, is unfortunately very, very limited. For example, a 2010 shortage resulted in pediatric Hodgkin's lymphoma patients receiving medication substitutions that unfortunately turned out to be less effective, as well as increasing complications for the delivery of that drug. If you could please, for the committee, describe the impact that you have seen from your work at the University of Michigan Medical School and what Congress should be aware of that isn't right now being captured by just looking at the data.
Thank you for that question, Senator. So you're absolutely right. One of the challenges of drug shortages is that it requires hospitals to essentially MacGyver different treatment opportunities and regimens, which is not necessarily evidence or data-based. So as an example, the Hodgkin's lymphoma drug was not available, and as a result, very well-meaning oncologists switched to a different chemotherapeutic drug. The analogy that I'll use is when you're baking, you have a list of ingredients, and you need that list to be exactly what it is in order to have an end product. When you make a substitution, and you don't necessarily know how well that is going to work, the problem is you're not going to end up with a dry cake, you're going to end up with a child whose cancer hasn't been cured. That is a prescient example of where we are and where we have been going. I can speak more about impact on VA and current at your discretion, sir.
Well, we'll do that, but just in my final question to you, as we look at these drug shortages, clearly it has a big impact on a major medical center like the University of Michigan, but talk to me about the impact of smaller, less resourced hospitals, which is the majority of hospitals out there around the country.
You're absolutely right, sir. The major issue here is the disparities that exist. At major institutions, we have more staff and resources in order to anticipate and mitigate shortages, to make sure that we have enough product, conserve it, obtain it from other sources. Smaller institutions simply don't have that. What that creates is situations in which smaller hospitals may not know what the supply may look like elsewhere. They may be making rationing decisions that are not necessarily consonant with national guidelines or with what hospitals down the street are doing. For example, when we are short on a medication at Michigan Medicine, I have absolutely no idea what that supply looks like or what the workflow looks like at hospitals across the state. That begets disparities, that treats people unfairly, whether that's poor people in Detroit or whether that's people in a rural hospital in northern Michigan. They are suffering in ways that we can't even necessarily know.
Thank you. Ranking Member Portman, or Paul, Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you. I think one of the problems we face in healthcare policy is that people think it's unique. And we've got this unique problem. We have a shortage here, and so what are the peculiarities to healthcare policy? There may be some answers, but many of the answers, and probably the most important answers, are economic answers. Do price controls work, and do price controls lead to shortages? Yes, obviously they do. Some people say the Soviet Union was defeated, and they really weren't defeated in a big pitched military battle. They were defeated because they couldn't determine the price of bread. If you set the price too high, the bread rots on the shelves. If you set the price too low, there's no bread. If you set the bread too high, there's a black market. These are just things that happen with price controls. In capitalism, the signal that is given to everybody who manufactures something is the price. And the price is where supply meets demand. You know, it's a mathematical function, but it's also something that no one person can figure out. None of us are smart enough or have enough knowledge or bandwidth to figure this out. So 330 million Americans, but really billions of people worldwide are interacting, and that's how we determine the price of things. If doxycycline, which has been around forever, is used in acne and also still for infections and things, is in shortage and in low price, as soon as it becomes in shortage, the price will rise. In true capitalism, the price rises and they'll make more of it. But if you keep the price the same and there's a shortage, it just gets worse and worse and worse, and people leave the marketplace because you're keeping the price suppressed. There is no moral price. There is no right price. The Soviets or socialists or people who think they know what's best for people try to determine the moral price of things. There is only the price where supply meets demand if you want goods to be distributed. So you have to allow prices to go up and down. In essence, probably all of these problems are fixed by freeing up prices, and they have to go up and down fast. You know, Dr. Shuman mentioned, which is true, we got to get the information back. Everybody said we got to get the information back. Well, how come we don't have to tell Walmart to do that? I mean, that's the real question here. How come Walmart does it automatically? You scan something, you buy a chair at Walmart, or you buy food at Walmart, it goes into the computer in Bentonville, they're reading it. I always joke as I check out, somebody in Bentonville's already putting it on a truck, and it's going to be there an hour later. There's no reason medicine shouldn't work that way, but we have this mistaken notion that keep the prices low, suppress the prices, and then somehow we'll do good for people, we'll help poor people, and what it's done is it destroys the market. We also have regulations such that we essentially shut things down. I think the baby formula fiasco is a great example. It's not even prescription really, but the FDA oversees this. There was some question, and still is a question to this day, whether the bacteria that the children unfortunately died from had anything to do with the plant. They did a DNA analysis on it. It was a different bacteria, and yet we shut the plant down. To combine the problems that make it worse, we wouldn't let any imported stuff. It's like they don't put iron in it in Europe. It's like you think our kids are going to, you know, you can debate how much iron should be in formula, and 10 different experts can tell you how much iron should be in formula, but for goodness sakes, wouldn't it be better to have some formula than no formula? But we don't allow international competition. We should do that in drugs as well. If we had international competition, it helps to keep our prices down, but it also would help to you know, keep the supply up as well. But these are things we've talked about for decades, and actually many in my party have opposed allowing the reimportation or allowing you to shop internationally. I think that would help, but you have to free up prices. So if we only look at the back end where we say, oh, we're going to come in and we're going to tell government and tell hospitals how to look at things, that's one way of looking at it, but it's like you don't even have to do that. Free up prices, and when people make pricing decisions, the prices go up automatically and more of the stuff gets produced. We don't have to have like government figure out how to institute capitalism. We just have to get government as much out of the way and allow more capitalism. Another thing we could do, and I'll direct this question to Dr. Goodman, is the patient has to encounter the price for the pricing system to work. If you have a deductible of $10, you don't encounter the price. You don't care what. You get heart surgery and it costs $3 million and your toothpaste costs $42. Why? Because they can and you don't care. The patient has to care. You have to connect the patient to the price. One of the things we do in our country is we limit how much you can put in a health savings account. We also limit who can get them. Health savings account is basically capitalism. These are people encountering, at least for their first set of dollars, seeing the price, understanding the price, and making decisions on price. One of the proposals I've had is instead of only having 10% of the public allowed to have it legally, let everybody has insurance or doesn't have insurance, have an HSA. Everybody's got kids with crooked teeth, and now they all have beautiful teeth, but it costs a fortune. But it'd be nice to be tax deductible for everybody, even if you have a low deductible policy. Why shouldn't you be allowed to have an HSA? So I guess the question to you, Dr. Goodman, is getting the patient or the consumer connected to the price important in this? Would HSAs be part of a reform?
Well, absolutely. If you think about aspirin, when I go to the store, I see Bayer aspirin, I see other brands. I identify with a brand. Bayer assures me that his product is good, and I trust them. When I get a generic drug, I don't know where it came from. I don't know what country it was produced in. And the only thing I would add to your analysis of price controls is what we have done is we've created a market where you can only compete on price. You cannot compete on reliability. Reliability is a valuable thing. The brand companies invest in reliability. So their drug will be there when the demand is there. In the generic market, if the only thing that matters is price, you don't care about reliability. You just want the lowest price possible, and that's what's
But
happening.
even in the generic market, when we have shortages, aren't they limited in raising their prices? At least to government and to most insurance policies. The prices, if I'm selling you doxycycline and I make it generically, the hospital's sort of got a fixed price, Medicare's got a fixed price, insurance got a fixed price. Isn't it pretty hard as there becomes a shortage to really even have price competition?
Well, as I said in the beginning, we have price controls in the Medicare Part B program, at least what the doctor can get. And in the 340B program, we have price controls. In general, people can pay more for a generic drug, but no one does because, again, we have a race to the bottom. We have no competition on reliability, consistency, safety, or even the efficacy of the drug. And half the time, or more than half the time, you don't even know where the drug came from. So if we could just make the generic market work as well as the brand market works, we would have huge improvement.
I have one question, but I'll come back to it.
Very good. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions. Senator Langford's looking up his notes, running in from the last hearing, trying to be able to get reset. Y'all, thank you. Many of us are running back and forth to multiple hearings today, and interesting enough, a lot of conversation on the Hill about drugs in general. One of my questions is, let me set a scenario in front of us. Russia invades Ukraine, and so immediately the United States cuts off Russian companies, and American companies based in Russia shut down. China invades Taiwan. The United States says, we're not going to do business with China right now. 10,000 some odd number of our active ingredients are coming out of China. What happens that next day? Yeah, John.
Well, 3 years ago, almost to this day, China threatened to cut us off. I mean, we were complaining about COVID, and they said, if you keep complaining, we'll just cut off your drugs. Now, it's not in their self-interest to do it, but China has a lot of power over our drug market, and we know that they care about things other than maximizing profit.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in on the conversation? Go ahead.
Thank you for that question, and I would say that that's one of the reasons why we need more transparency to identify exactly which products we're relying on China for and which ones we might have some diversification in. We also don't have any idea about the key starting materials that China is holding, and so that would be very important to investigate.
Go ahead.
May I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Aaron Fox said. I particularly want to emphasize that there is anecdotal evidence that we rely on China for the key raw chemicals that go into making our pharmaceuticals. That might be true. We just don't know because we haven't done the systematic analysis.
Okay. Who else is? Did you want to mention something on that as well? Go ahead.
Sure, I appreciate the question. I'll answer with a specific example. So this past year, one plant in Shanghai that produced a contrast material that's used for radiological scans across the board went down. And literally overnight, half of the U.S. supply of radioactive contrast for radiologic scans was unavailable. I work in the VA system. This impacted veterans literally overnight, where we needed to make decisions about whether we were going to allow some scans to be done to evaluate someone's cancer or treat someone's heart disease. Veterans deserve better, and we should not be reliant on a supply chain that's that tenuous.
So where are the next sources? What countries, what agencies, what entities, what drug companies are actually stepping up into this and saying we're bringing the manufacturing back here? We understand that we're vulnerable at this point, and so we're actually doing something about it.
It's my understanding that the brand companies, who also use overseas suppliers, mainly use Europe and maybe Puerto Rico, but they don't. I think most of our brand drugs are not produced in China or India. So the China and India production is there because of the race to the bottom and competing on price alone. If all you care about is price, you go to the place in the world where you can get price the lowest, and those are two countries where you can do that.
But that's also where the generic active ingredients are coming out of.
Yes.
Right.
what other countries or entities. I know Saudi Arabia and UAE are rapidly accelerating drug manufacturing and trying to be able to do some of the things to set up a process for that. There are other countries that are trying to engage in it, but I don't hear a lot of the race to try to figure out how we do low-cost alternatives in other places, because those low-cost alternatives in many of the older drugs are the only option and the only place that it's there. So it may be new technology and new innovation for one type, but for older technology and antibiotics and such, it's very different.
You know, Mark Cuban told me the other day that he's building a manufacturing plant right here in the United States, and he sells generic drugs. For him to be successful, I think he has to be able to advertise and convince the buyers that his product is reliable, consistent, safe, efficacious. But you know, he's selling, and this goes back to what Dr. Paul asked me, he's selling directly to the consumer. They don't even accept third-party payment. And maybe that manufacturer-to-consumer model is going to work better than everything else we've been experiencing.
It can't work worse than the PBM model that we currently have.
I agree with that.
Okay, anyone else make comment on that, other places?
Senator, I do want to talk a little bit about the promise of pharmaceutical continuous manufacturing. These are sort of novel approaches to manufacturing that hold great promise in terms of bringing our medicine supply onshore. It might make sense particularly for certain critical medicines that we rely on as patients. Pharmaceutical continuous manufacturing can be scaled up rapidly. It has lower production costs. It has a smaller environmental footprint, but we need to make it easier for manufacturers to enter the market. Manufacturers, remember here we're talking about drugs where manufacturers are getting paid pennies per unit. And so we need to make it easier for them by funding things like workforce development. People in this country don't know how to work with these new technologies necessarily. They're new. We need to, build out industry-wide best practices, methodologies, and Congress has actually funded legislation to be able to the omnibus spending law actually addresses this point. So I look forward to where that goes, and it's a great first step.
Well, we have found ways to be able to push a lot of the manufacturing out of Puerto Rico that was well known for having a lot of the drug manufacturing, and push it out of the United States and multiple other areas. We currently are one of the worst countries in the world for R&D based on our current tax policy. It literally punishes companies for doing R&D here. We currently are getting out of the manufacturing tax policy, where for manufacturing it was up until this past year that you could actually get a full expensing for that. Now that full expensing has just gone away, and we're actually punishing people for doing manufacturing here. So if we don't fix our tax policy and incentivize manufacturing to actually be here rather than punishing people to do manufacturing here, and if we don't reduce some of the hoops to actually do the manufacturing or allow innovation, like what you've talked about on this, to be able to do directly from the manufacturer in other ways and get around some of the PBMs, we're in trouble. But currently, there's very little incentive to be able to onshore things based on our tax policy and our regulatory environment when we desperately need it. And when I ask people about how quickly can we get drugs out of China to be able to do this and just get access to it, they talk in decades, not in years. That's not a good scenario for us right now with currently a growing hostile threat from the Chinese. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Blumenthal, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing on a problem that really has been longstanding. Dr. Shuman, you referred to the shortages of propofol 15 years ago. I was absolutely astonished in visiting some of our hospitals 12, 15 years ago to discover the shortage of anesthetics like that one. So this problem has been around for a long time in the greatest country in the history of the world capable of providing the greatest health care on the planet. We seem to be unable to provide enough of these basic medicines, anesthetics. You know, this is not kind of the advanced care, cancer treatment that no doubt you're using in the course of your oncology practice. This is what the workhorse medicine. Why is it that anesthetics are in short supply? Are they still now? Should ask that question first. And why was it then and why is it now, if it's still the case?
Thank you for that question, and I agree completely. The problem here is many of these sterile injectable drugs are frankly very complicated to make, and when companies are making pennies on the dollar per unit, it's very hard to incentivize their production for many of the reasons that have been brought up earlier. The issue with propofol 15 years ago was that there were contaminants within the drug. It was a mold and glass shards, I believe, were in the medication, which, again, you don't need to know much to know is a problem. That became another problem yet again during the early COVID pandemic when we were struggling to keep people on ventilators comfortable for exactly that reason. So the broader problem here involves generic sterile injectables and the complexity of their production and the lack of sufficient incentive for companies to be able to make them, especially onshore.
Is there still a shortage of anesthetics?
Yes. A number of different drugs, and I believe Dr. Fox can add more details to that, but the short answer is yes.
But presumably the contaminant issue has been resolved. Is it still the very tiny margins of profit that are a disincentive to these companies to make this workhorse medicine?
Short answer is yes. The process of making these is also quite complicated in terms of the facilities that are utilized. For example, propofol is in a lipid solution, which just is much more at risk for contamination than many others, but I'll defer to Dr. Fox and others for more details.
And I know you're an oncologist, not an economist, so I'll ask the question first and then turn to others who can speak on the economics, but I suspect, just as a lawyer and non-economist, non-doctor, something wrong here when anesthetics, workhorse medicine needed by every single hospital in the country somehow are not responding to demand signals, or the demand signals aren't working. Why is it that we're not seeing more production? The capitalist system, and we all believe in capitalism. I am a strong supporter of capitalism. But in this situation, why isn't it working? I'll take the end of the table first and then we'll
Suppose I tell you as a manufacturer, if you pay me $1 more, I'll overinvest in capacity and we won't have any shortages and I'll meet your demand. I, under the current rules, cannot do that. I can only compete on price. And if you can only compete on price, it's a race to the bottom on everything else, including reliability of supply. It's that simple.
Take Senator Paul's analogy, bread. Someone's going to produce more bread if there's more demand. The price will rise, and the demand will be met.
But suppose the grocery store owner, like the pharmacist, is compelled to sell you the lowest price bread that comes his way, then the quality of bread would go through the floor. And that's what's happening here. It's not the quality, it's the reliability, safety.
But these are all reliable, safe anesthetics. They're not selling
No, but
snake oil.
the manufacturing process is not reliable. Compare that to brand name drugs.
Someone would make a more reliable process. If you're, to take a different analogy, if you're in a company that puts satellites in space and they don't make it into space, they're not reliable, you're not going to get paid. A product that can't be delivered will not be relied on, and they'll turn to another manufacturer. I don't understand.
The FDA does not allow me to charge you a little bit more for reliable supply. It forces me to compete only on price. If I'm competing only on price, then sometimes I'm going to run out of product or won't be able to meet demand. But that's the only way I can compete. So
You're blaming it on the FDA.
yes.
Okay, let's take the next.
Sure. So, unlike an iPhone or anything else we buy at Walmart, we don't have the information about how good is the quality. We don't have a rating system. We have no way to differentiate between the products. And your example about the anesthetics, they are still in short supply, in part because there are usually only 1 or 2 companies making those drugs. And also, there's really no incentive for one company to do a better job. If one company did do a better job, we have no way of knowing that. Unlike other things we buy, we have no rating system and no way to do that. And I'll tell you, unlike other products, people's lives are at stake. It's not just a matter of maybe not buying peanut butter today or not buying a tire. It's having to decide to use a lower quality product or a product that we know won't work as well just because we don't have the access to it in our hospital.
Well, I am out of time, but I am also so far unsatisfied that we have really identified what the actionable policy should be here. And I can't blame it all on the FDA. I'm sorry. There have to be other reasons, and I think Dr. Schumer suggests in his testimony, whether it's bringing some of the supply chain back to this country, producing more here, I don't think that you can just blame it on the FDA. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Paul, for holding this hearing. And to our witnesses, thank you all for your insights and the important work that you do. Look, my office, like I think all of our offices, frequently hears from constituents about the challenges they are facing to fill prescriptions and purchase over-the-counter medications that their families use on a daily basis. So I'm really glad we're holding this hearing. I want to start with a question to you, Dr. Shuman. In 2017, the FDA reported that 80% of active ingredients used in medicines were manufactured in China and India. This manufacturing monopoly is one of the root causes of the drug shortage, and relying on China for active ingredients is a national security and public health risk. So, Dr. Shuman, how can the United States shore up domestic drug manufacturing and better protect our supply chains from potential conflicts with China?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your advocacy on this issue. I completely agree with you that this is a national security concern. It is something that we need to deal with. I think incentivizing production on American soil is critical. The devil's, of course, in the details of what that looks like, but I would consider drug manufacturing to be critical infrastructure. If we have crumbling bridges, we fix them. If we don't have medications that we need, we build the factories and we incentivize companies, whether it's private partner or public-private partnerships or other types of arrangements, to make the critical drugs that are quite expensive to make on American soil.
Thank you. Ms. Fox, I want to turn to you. The FDA maintains a list of essential medications and medical devices that's intended to inform which supply chains are most critical to support. That's a really important baseline. However, some medications like Adderall and some children's medicines aren't on the FDA's essential medicines list. Many Americans need these medications, and the FDA and other entities need to do a better job of managing these particular supply chains, as you discussed in your testimony. What can the FDA and other organizations do to identify and then prioritize addressing supply chain vulnerabilities for drugs that are not on the essential medicines list?
Thank you so much for that question. We really do need to address transparency. We absolutely need to get more information about the true vulnerabilities, exactly where we are missing information, where the key starting materials are coming from. And we can't focus our efforts on every drug. And so with limited resources, we need to really drill down to which products are most vulnerable. FDA's essential medicines list was actually not intended to identify those that are most vulnerable. It was really kind of targeted towards, taking care of patients in an acute pandemic, honestly. And so that list, if we really do need to revise it and identify those items that are most critically relying on products that we actually can't get.
Okay, thank you. To Ms. Rogvendran, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia Medicine Supply Map collects and analyzes data from across the world to pinpoint drug manufacturing supply chain vulnerabilities. This map can help prevent shortages and ensure quality. How could FDA use the medicine supply map or similar data to better address vulnerabilities in the medical supply chain?
Senator, thank you for the question. We see many applications of data intelligence like the medicine supply map. We think there's value not just to the FDA, but also within the private sector. On a day-to-day basis, it is in the private sector that the supply chain is managed, and it's the stakeholders in the private sector that are responsible for getting medicines to patients when they need it. The FDA drug shortages team also uses information such as this to manage drug shortages. And the ways you can use it, so for example, if you're a manufacturer, it would be great to know that your competitor might have a drug shortage, because then you can ramp up your production to meet that demand. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're a hospital, it's really good to know what are the critical medicines that are going to, likely have a shortage, because then you can plan for it. You can either contract with additional suppliers, and if the shortage were actually to happen, you have time to prepare. I mean, Dr. Shuman and Dr. Fox can talk about how when the shortage happens, hospital staff are scrambling to figure out alternate treatment protocols and so forth.
Right, and I appreciate that hospitals and private manufacturers may want to use this data, but I also think it's really essential that the FDA and the United States government use this data too, so it can be looking at the whole map, not just an individual region's particular experience, and really begin to plan and make sure, again, that we're treating this as the critical kind of infrastructure that it is. Quickly, in my remaining time, I want to start with a question to Ms. Fox and Dr. Shuman, because earlier this month, I introduced a bill with Ranking Member Paul to get more generic drugs to market faster. Under current law, FDA may reject an application for a generic drug without telling the generic drug manufacturer what part of the formula was wrong, which can ultimately lead to really time-consuming delays. By simply telling a generic drug manufacturer what adjustments they need to make, our bipartisan bill would help improve the generic market approval process and lower drug prices overall. Are there other aspects of FDA's generic approval process that could be improved and help more generics make it to the market in a more timely way? And we'll start with you, Ms. Fox.
Thank you for that question. I think when we think about the generic drug approval process, we know that FDA does prioritize products that are in shortage, and so those do get bumped up to the top of the list, which is great. But I think it's also really important to understand which companies are set to do a good job, which companies are investing in their quality manufacturing, and those products should potentially also get priority. Why should we approve a product from a factory that is old and crumbling and is likely to have all of its medicines recalled because they're contaminated?
Well, and also, why should we slow a company down by not telling them where they're off? Dr. Shuman, quickly, would you like to comment on that process as well?
I completely agree. I will say that as an institution, we have no idea what that quality looks like, and if legislation can clarify for buyers, either hospitals or GPOs or others, whether or not the product we're buying is of higher quality and is thus more reliable, it would go a long way. And I would argue that the market would pay more for that if we were able to clarify that we're paying for a higher quality product.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hessen. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, as chairman of this committee, in February of 2020, the very start of the pandemic, I held a roundtable with former CDC Director Julie Gerberding and former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. And the main takeaway from that roundtable was that we don't produce the precursor chemicals. We don't produce the API. That was more than 3 years ago. We have spent trillions of dollars. I think we misspent many of those trillions of dollars. I'm not sure we even spent a dime addressing that problem that we pointed out in February of 2020. So again, you want to point the finger of blame at somebody, point the finger of blame at Congress that spent trillions of dollars, $1 trillion infrastructure bill, a China bill that made sure we could make chips, but we did nothing in terms of precursor chemicals and the API. Dr. Goodman, I want to talk a little bit about generics and the completely unlevel playing field. I think what certainly was revealed during our, and I would say miserably failed response to COVID, is we not only ignored, but we sabotaged the research into cheap, widely available, generally safe generic drugs. And there were a host of them that some doctors were using. I certainly referred people that called me up to these doctors. I was amazed at some of the results. But what was revealed is that the playing field, generics versus expensive patentable drugs, completely tilted in the favor of random controlled trials. And let's face it, there's not the dollars available in generic drugs to do random controlled trials. So all of a sudden, observational studies were put to the side, like they weren't valid. When in many cases, the doctors I've talked to, that might have the greatest validity. Can you just kind of speak to that unlevel playing field between patentable drugs and cheap generic, and I'll call them molecules because some of these things are just miracle molecules. For example, Nobel Prize-winning drugs that were then trashed by our FDA.
Well, the first point I want to make is that when you have a pandemic that you don't know anything about, and it's new, and we really don't know what to do with it. You want experimentation. You want to know what doctors in New York are doing, in California. You want them to communicate with each other.
That wasn't allowed, was it?
It was
that
strongly
shut
discouraged.
Down. It was censored.
Yes.
The doctors who had the courage and compassion to treat patients were vilified, including from this dais. They were vilified.
I agree. Now, if you compare that to what's happened with cancer drugs, maybe half the cancer drugs these days are off-label. So how did that happen? Well, it's because doctors experimenting and communicating with each other and writing in medical journals. And let me make a second point about randomized controlled trials. For years and years and years, we thought this is the way to do it. You have this group, they take the pill, this group takes a placebo, and then you compare them, and if there's not a significant difference, you don't allow the drug on the market. But over time, people noticed that over here in the people who are taking the drug, even though the group as a whole wasn't significantly different from the placebo group, some people did remarkably well. And then it dawned on people, well, look, maybe it has something to do with the DNA of the patients. And once you understand that, you begin to realize that these controlled trials don't tell you all you need to know. Some people may respond well to a drug, and other people may not. And we simply have to recognize that. So I'm in favor of doctors being able to experiment. If something's working with the patient, let the patient and the doctor do it, and let's not censor anything that's not coming out of the CDC.
You mentioned there's a pretty high percentage of drugs that are prescribed off-label, correct? Do you have a number off the top of your head?
No, but I think for cancer, it's half of them.
I've heard something like 20% of all drugs, 20 to 30% are prescribed off-label. By the way, that's called the practice of medicine. That's how we actually advance medicine, okay, as opposed to a dictate coming from doctors in these agencies that don't practice medicine. That's been a real problem. Let's talk a little bit about the revolving door between our federal health agencies, and I would call it the capture by big pharma of our federal health agencies. The two individuals I just spoke of that testified before our committee in a roundtable in February 2020, they're now, one of them is director of Pfizer. Talk about how harmful that is in terms of the public trust and the public getting correct, honest, transparent information from our federal government.
Well, all I can say is there's an economic literature on the economics of regulation. And going all the way back to the ICC, was one of our first regulatory agencies, right up through the end of the last century, many studies showed that regulatory capture often happens, maybe not 100% capture, but the regulatory agencies tend to do the bidding of the industry they regulate. And this is well known, whether it's taxi cabs or railroads or trucking, this has happened over and over again. It is definitely a problem.
Do you find, have our federal health agencies been transparent and honest during this pandemic in general?
No, and I think I read something, I think I read an expose in the New York Times just the other day where people who worked in the CDC said they were not transparent and were angry that they couldn't speak freely to the public.
I agree with that. I've written over 50 oversight letters. I've gotten mostly non-response responses when I've got any response whatsoever. Just came from a finance committee hearing. We had Secretary Becerra in front of us. We, through FOIA, court-ordered FOIA, about 4,000 pages of HHS documents were released. A lot of Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins emails. Those were heavily redacted to FOIA. Congress is not subject to those redactions, so together with Senator Paul and I think Senator Hawley and two other of my colleagues, we wrote a letter, and there's a law that says if we, 5 of us, write a letter, those documents shall be turned over to us. Well, they haven't been. In the accommodation process, we targeted 400 pages. They didn't turn them over to us, but they did allow us to read 50 pages at a time in a reading room. Couldn't take copies, took notes. It's been over a year since the last 50 pages have not been turned over to us. A year, 50 pages, heavily redacted. And I asked Secretary Becerra to commit to turning those last 50 pages over to us. I certainly hope he does, but again, that just proves just one example of how the agencies simply have not been transparent and honest with the American public, and the American public has a right to know.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this important hearing on this critical subject. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. You know, I just have to say, I think that we're suffering from a increased market concentration here in the United States with the pharmaceutical companies, combined with over-reliance on foreign nations and foreign industry abroad. And we put those two things together, it's disastrous. It's disastrous not just for our industry, though that is absolutely true, it's disastrous for everyday consumers. And this is one of the reasons, let's take a drug that we haven't yet talked about, but that millions of people, 34 million at least people in this country rely on every day, and that's insulin. We got 3 companies in this country that produce insulin, and yet the cost of it, which has not substantially changed in terms of manufacturing it over the last century, insulin's been around forever, the cost of it has just exploded. Now, why is that? I'd submit to you one of the reasons is market concentration. This is why one of the reasons, by the way, I've introduced legislation that would cap the cost of insulin on a monthly basis at $25. I think that Americans should not be paying more out of pocket than that, and I don't think that these monopolies ought to be ripping off consumers in order to pad their own profits. And for the same reason, I'm very concerned about our over-reliance on China in particular. And I would just notice, and I want to get into some of these statistics, that our over-reliance on China when it comes to these drugs has really exploded since the turn of the century. I mean, since 1999, 2000, 2001. What happened around that time? Well, we gave China most favored nation status on a permanent basis. We brought China into the WTO and gave them full access to the international trade market. Disastrous mistake. They weaponized it. They've taken our industry. They have taken control in many cases of manufacturing, including some of this drug market. It's really exceptional. So I think this ought to be a wake-up call that it's time to change course. Ms. Raghavendran, let me start with you. Your medicine supply map, which Senator Hassan mentioned a second ago, I think is great and really shows just how dependent on foreign manufacturers we have become. Just looking at the manufacturing locations associated with active API drug master files, if I'm reading it correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, fully 60%, as of 2021, 60% were based either in India or in China. In the United States accounts for just 10%. And what caught my attention is the change over the last 20 years. I mean, here again, in 2000, India contributed 20% of active API files. That percentage tripled by 2021 to 62%. In 2000, China contributed just 4% of active API files. That share increased sixfold by 2021 to 23%. By contrast, what happened in this country in 2000, the United States contributed 15% of active API, but in 2021, just 4%. In Europe, really, 49% they contributed in 2000, only 7% by 2021. That is really, really astounding. So let me just ask you, do you think that being overexposed to China and India, and of course we know that China supplies India with 80% of its APIs, China being, or India rather, being the world's largest producer of generic drugs. Do you think being overexposed to China has major implications for our national security?
Senator Hawley, thank you for the question. I am not a national security expert. I'm a drug shortages expert. What I can tell you is that we see 4 different types of risk for drug shortage. Geographic concentration is one of them. But there's other factors. There's low prices, there's manufacturing complexity, and there's quality failures. So when we design solutions, we have to look at the whole picture, and it's a multifaceted problem.
Let me ask you about the U.S.-China Commission's recommendation. They recommended that the United States, and I'm quoting them now, maximize the production of such goods, meaning drug precursors and other critical medical supplies, maximize the production of such goods domestically or as appropriate from trusted countries. Do you agree with that recommendation?
Senator, I think the specifics matter, and I'd be happy to get back to you with a statement for the record, but USB doesn't have a position on that.
Dr. Shuman, let me just ask you, because in your written testimony, you mentioned the Shanghai plant example. You brought it up again, I think, to Senator Blumenthal. What a dramatic impact that had on your practice and your patients at the VA, and of course, not just yours, but at VA hospitals nationwide. Give me your view on this. Just tell us about, for your patients, the people that you serve, what does our over-reliance and exposure to foreign adversaries, China's a foreign adversary, what does that mean practically for them in moments of crisis and moments of danger in situations like we had with COVID and may have in the future should we be in a kinetic conflict with China?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your advocacy on this really important issue. I confess I know much more about surgical anatomy than the geopolitical situation that we're talking about. But what I will say is when I'm talking to my patients, frankly, whether it's a veteran or someone at a private hospital, they don't necessarily care where the drug is coming from or what is going on other than the fact that they don't have it. And that's how I feel as well. As a doctor, as an ethicist, as somebody with administrative oversight of drug shortage management, what we are dealing with is a situation in which doctors, patients are truly handcuffed by the seemingly unpredictable nature of these drug shortages. And this is a perfect example where one single factory going down dramatically impacted our supply. So there's absolutely no doubt that we are vulnerable as a nation, but also as individual patients and doctors to this issue. And I'm so thankful that this committee is facing this head on and that we can hopefully bring the supply back to American soil in a way that will allow us to be more reliable.
Let me just ask before my time expires, Dr. Fox, last week the committee held a hearing on cybersecurity risks in the healthcare sector, and I was particularly concerned about risks to rural healthcare. And so let me ask you about that in this context, drug shortages and their effect on rural communities. Do drug shortages, disproportionately affect rural hospitals, rural communities? Should we be concerned about that?
Yes, they do, and in part because those rural communities often don't have full resources like academic medical centers like I and Dr. Shuman work at. They are disparately impacted. And just to your past line of questioning, I do want to just say that private companies are choosing to invest in China and manufacture there, and yet they don't reveal where they're making their products. It's not a requirement for those companies to reveal which products are made in China, which products are made in India, which products are made in the US. And without that information, we really are vulnerable.
That's a great point, and I hope something that this committee can work on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul. Thank you, all of you, for being here today and your testimony, because this hearing and finding solutions, it not only matters to patients, to ourselves, to our own budgets, people's kitchen table budget, what they pay, their access, rural and urban, but I would say it's also not just our national security, but our economy. So the implications, personal and nationwide, worldwide, have a huge impact. And so we have to figure out what those incentives are. We're going to build on what some of my colleagues have already said to increase pharmaceutical independence, because we know 80% of the key ingredients, they come from overseas. China and India, I'm not going to say what my colleagues have already said, but like others on the committee, I, of course, am concerned about this over-reliance and the risk it poses, again, to families, to the ones we love and their health care, and their ability to get it, and our national security as well. And last Congress, I worked with Senator Tim Scott to introduce the Made in America Act. It's bipartisan legislation to create a tax credit for pharmaceutical manufacturers to operate in certain distressed communities across the United States, creating good-paying jobs and retaking control of our drug supply chain. I'm pleased at the number of the FDA-related provisions of our bill were passed into law as part of the FY23 omnibus. And so if we're serious about this, I do agree we need to do a better job bringing life-saving drugs here. So Dr. Fox, a core pillar of the Made in America Act was to increase collaboration between FDA's drug shortage staff and the Office of Compliance. Both are mission critical, we know that, in helping prevent these shortages and monitoring supply chains. So how should the FDA be thinking about implementing this provision and linking these two important offices together? What can we do there?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator Rosen. You know, those two offices do work together closely, but usually it's only during a drug shortage. Outside of that, they don't often work together. And so certainly you could envision if Congress is able to change the labeling laws to require drug companies to disclose where products are made, perhaps where their sources are made. Perhaps the Offices of Compliance could work much closer together with FDA to try to enforce that.
To give a better bill of materials, if you will.
Yes.
And do you have any other incentives you might like us to try to do while we work on being sure that we can build this collaboration?
You know, I think it's important to think about how we do need private industry to make changes, especially to their quality, and if we're also going to ask them to do a little bit more work to reveal their sources of where they're manufacturing drugs. The societal benefits are much, much greater than any benefit the manufacturers could get. And so I think we need to structure incentives appropriately, but certainly with Office of Compliance and FDA working closer together, we could probably get there.
Yeah, I think it's good to have transparency, that's for sure. And we want to think about some other ways that we can potentiate this and how we support our nonprofit pharmaceutical industry as well. That's another big component. And so tackling these drug shortages, increasing the access, of course, to critical medications. I don't have to tell any of you. It's an all-of-the-above approach. There's not just one thing that's going to fix it. It's going to be many little things, perhaps. And so without the need to maximize profits, shareholders, worrying about shareholders, nonprofits, maybe they can focus on lower prices to stabilize supply, lower costs, and again, improve access across the country. It's all about saving people's lives in the long run, right? So I'm pleased in the omnibus was signed into law legislation that I co-wrote with Senator Romney to direct the GAO to study the impact of nonprofit generic drug companies that they would have on lowering these drug costs, addressing the drug shortages, and accelerating the development of new drugs. Some of my colleagues have already asked questions to that. But what I want to ask, I guess I'll keep picking on you, Dr. Fox, today. We have such a great panel and not enough time for every question, but how can the nonprofit pharmaceutical model, how can that help to mitigate the shortages, particularly given its focus on maximizing access to life-saving medication, particularly in those underserved areas, urban and, of course, rural?
Thank you so much for that question. You know, I am very familiar with one of the nonprofit drug companies, which is Civica RX, which is based in Utah. I do serve as a volunteer on their advisory board. That company is really focused on making high quality medications inside the United States. They have a factory that's almost ready in Virginia. They're also partnering with a company to make the active pharmaceutical ingredients in the U.S. as well, with Flow. That was a little bit of the money spent during COVID. You guys did actually give some to Flow for that. So, you know, these nonprofit pharmaceutical companies are able to make high-quality products, focus in on you know, building better facilities, building a more resilient supply. The way that Civica works is that our hospital has to make a long-term commitment to buy a certain amount of product. And what that does is that allows the nonprofit company to know exactly how much to make. They're not in a guessing game of being in a price war with somebody. We've committed to buy that product. And those, you know, reliable supply agreements really do help shore up the overall supply chain.
It's terrific, and thank you again all for being here. And at the end of the day, it's about the health of the ones we love, the availability, the accessibility, the affordability, and we need to bring that back here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Ranking Member Paul has a few closing questions.
I think it's been a good discussion. Everybody seems to agree there's a problem. That's a good starting point. But like most of the discussions, I agree somewhat with Senator Blumenthal. The description of the problem is much easier than the actual availability of the answer. All four of you have said that there are a lack of incentives that lead to shortages. So what are incentives? Allowing the price to rise, removing price controls so prices can rise for a generic, particularly when they become the only one. When there's a shortage of supply, you have to allow the price to rise. So some have said, well, there's a race to the bottom on prices. Well, maybe prices are more elastic on the downward side than they are on the upward. So there aren't many regulations saying that you can't lower your price, but there are a lot of regulations that say you can't raise your price. So what happens is, you think about it, Medicaid and Medicare are at least half, if not more than, you know, half. Their prices are stuck. If you have a shortage of doxycycline, the price needs to go up. The price won't go up for Medicare. But private insurance is pretty sticky too. The contracts are long-term, and they've made long-term contracts. The gas station, the prices go up and down every day. So they can meet supply and demand. You have to get to that. That's the answer. That is the answer. You have to allow prices to go up and down. It's sticky prices, inelastic prices that cause shortages. Now, you say you want other incentives. What else can we do? Well, there's two other ways you could help companies. You could either subsidize them or give them a tax break. Now, people on our side of the aisle tend most of the time not to be in favor of subsidies, because if you give a subsidy to somebody who's not even good at something, you've squandered your subsidy. If you give them a tax break, they only get it if they're good at it, because you only get to deduct your profit. If you don't make a profit, the tax break doesn't do you anything. Now, we did once upon a time have huge tax breaks in Puerto Rico. It was 100% tax credit. So if this body wants more American and closer to home production, reinstitute the Puerto Rico tax break. But I'd go one step further, and I agree with Senator Rosen. We have a bill that would take the opportunity zones that have been designed as poverty areas in our country, and there's a bunch of them in every state. We would say to the pharmaceutical industry, we're not just going to give you what the last tax bill did, we're going to go further, because really they haven't worked that well. I'm all for them. I called them economic freedom zones. I've been talking about them for 5-6 years. Jack Kemp talked about them 20 years ago. They never have really worked because the incentives haven't been good enough or have been too difficult to get the incentives. So let's make them bigger. Either tax credit like we used to have, or lower or abolish the income taxes. Let's make it immediate, and let's let them start doing it, because they haven't moved because the incentive's not enough. So we could have more domestic production. And then the only thing I'll finish with is, I think we have to be careful as a country not to have irrational anger towards China. Look, I've been talking about the COVID coming from the lab for 2 years, so I'm not an apologist for China, but at the same time, I don't want to end trade with China. And it was mentioned here, you end trade with China, you want to see shortages, you're going to see a catastrophe. So we can't overnight do that. Should we encourage more production here? Yeah, let's have more production here. But let's don't be irrational in our anger towards China such that we disconnect and have no trade. Both of our countries have grown wealthy because we have traded, and we should be wary of that before we go further. But I think it was a great panel, and I hope people will take to heart that everybody believes we need more incentives. We have to figure out how those incentives can be put into action. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. So I think this is an important issue that we have to really drill down on, so a little bit more clarification on it and picking up on the questions that Ranking Member Paul has. When he says that we have sticky prices that can't go up, that's because there are contracts, the Medicare contracts and others, which is part of capitalism. If you're a really big customer, you will negotiate for a price. That's pure capitalism, and then you lock into a contract to do that, which is part of the market. But is that the reason why we're seeing shortages? Is because we have big customers locking in contracts for a price? I'm a little concerned. In fact, in our report, the fludarabine is a drug that had a shortage here, and I see once it was in shortage, it was less than $300 a vial. Then all of a sudden, the manufacturer raised it to $2,736 per vial. I suppose, especially if you only have one manufacturer making a drug, you own that market, and the price could go right through the ceiling as well. So talk to us a little bit about price controls. Dr. Goodman talks about price controls. Are there price controls by the FDA, or are these contracts that folks who are big customers are entering into in order to have some control over the prices that consumers pay? That's usually a good way to make sure consumers are not gouged, is by having a long-term contract. Any of you can answer that. Dr. Fox, you're shaking your head.
Thanks, Senator Peters. I will say that you're exactly right with the contracting. The reason why hospitals can't pay 10 times the amount for a drug next week is because we will still only get paid our capitated rate that has been locked in for years. And so the insurance and the way that we pay for health care in this country really doesn't allow for prices to change every day like at the gas station.
Anybody else? Dr. Goodman?
Well, again, I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself. This is in the report that you all put together, which I think is a very good description of the problem. And what your own report says is this is a market where people compete only on price. And I just want to say again, if buyers and sellers only compete on price and nothing else, we're going to get a race to the bottom of all the other features of the product, including reliability. And what I mean by reliability is, the product is there when you need it. And if you sacrifice reliability, you're going to have shortages. And so if I could just take Mark Cuban's plant, for an example, what could you all do to make sure that Mark Cuban is successful with his U.S.-based plant? You could allow him to say, look, the FDA can come by my plant any day of the week, drop of the hat, no prior announcement, and inspect my facility. That doesn't happen in India, doesn't happen in China. So I'm held to a higher safety standard than those guys overseas. And furthermore, I'm going to invest in reliability, so when you come to what does he call it, cost plus drugs, when you come to cost plus drugs online, it's going to be there when you need it. And so if he could say those kinds of things to his consumers, he would be competing in the right way.
So you're saying if the FDA is preventing
Yes.
companies from saying, well,
Yes.
Is that accurate? Dr. Shuman, you can't assess the quality of a drug? There's not information because the FDA just simply doesn't allow you to have the information?
I can't answer the regulatory question. I defer to Dr. Fox. I will say we, as individual doctors and institutions, do not have any way of gauging quality. And the answer for that, I believe Dr. Fox is about to tell us.
Thank you. That's true. Because there's no requirement for any company to list which company even made the drug, where it was made, the sources of raw material, there's no way to assess which company has a good quality record and which company has a bad quality record.
That's a lack of transparency. That's not the FDA saying you
no,
can't say that.
Well, FDA can't share that information. FDA has the information, but legally they can't share.
They have the information about all these drugs?
Most of it.
But they're just not sharing it.
Correct. And Congress could change the labeling law to require drug companies to disclose that. And they could also change the law to allow the FDA to disclose that. But right now, the companies decide what is confidential.
And yet even a lot of the companies don't know where some of this stuff comes from, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, Chairman Peters, just to add some color to what Dr. Fox shared. When we analyze labels, only 3% of labels actually listed who the active ingredient manufacturer is. So there's very little information in the public domain about who makes these drugs.
But does the company know? That just and the company knows and the FDA knows, you're telling me? Or we don't know because that's just not really tracked?
Well, the finished dose manufacturer that purchases the active ingredient will know who the active
So they will know. Do they
They
provide
will
that information to the FDA and the FDA is just not telling anybody?
Yeah, Senator, I'd have to, the FDA has certain confidentiality requirements, so that bind them.
So there's also, the report shows that there are multiple layers of manufacturing processes, but that could also create false appearance that there's actually diversity in the suppliers. I think all of you have touched on this. And I think there are 12 FDA-approved manufacturers, fludarabine, which is the one I mentioned here earlier, a critical drug for treating childhood and adult cancers, but only a handful of those approved are actually supplying the drug. So it looks like there's a lot of diversity, but there really isn't. There's just a couple companies out there. And that's lack of transparency. Talk to me about that, why that's a problem, Dr. Fox?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I can look and it looks like there are maybe 6 or 7 suppliers of this product, no problem if we have a shortage because the other companies might be able to make up the difference. But when all of those companies are actually getting their product from just 1 or 2 sources, then we have a false sense of security. And all of that information in your report, which is fantastic, is really not publicly available to anyone at a hospital to do that level of research.
But it is available to the FDA. They have all of that information.
It is, but I don't believe that they can access it well. A lot of that information is buried in PDFs, and it can change. They only get the information once a year as a snapshot in time.
Any other comments? Well, we've got to dive into these issues. We're going to be talking to all of you more than just what we can cover here with all that's happening today, as well as votes occurring right now, which is why my committee is now all gone, except for me, as they run to vote. But I look forward to working with each and every one of you as we look for some solutions. There's no question that identifying a problem always is easier than identifying solutions, but this committee is about solutions, and we would need your expertise to help us sort this out so that we can deal with this problem. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today and offering very important testimony. The testimony we received today and findings identified in my report that we put out today certainly point to the need for reforms, and I intend to work with my colleagues and will introduce legislation to address the underlying causes of these shortages as we seek out appropriate solutions to what are clearly major problems. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on April 6th for the submission of statements and questions for the record. Thank you again. This hearing is now adjourned.